there's been mounted. Hello, this is David Heine. Today we're at the museum where there's a new exhibition of German painter Georg Baselitz. Baselitz is one of the contemporary leading lights in the modern painting world. And with us today is Rudi Fuchs, an expert on Baselitz and also the director of the Stedelijk Museum. Rudi, maybe you could tell me first a little about the history of the Stedelijk Museum.
It's all work that has been done. It has to do with Holland, in a sense, because paintings that have been shown here in earlier exhibitions, paintings that were acquired here, drawings, prints, except for these new works, of course. But they are premiered in Holland. So, but Baselitz has a long history in this country. I mean, he had an exhibition in '72 for the first time at a small gallery. Then he had one in
important that you find out what the puppet, what his specialties are. With him you make totally other movements than with any other puppets from our theater. So you have to find out what his capabilities are, and you, as a puppeteer, you shouldn't insist too much on what you want yourself. You just have to follow the puppet and what his character is and what his kind of specific movements are, what his strong points are. So you have to find out that in the beginning, and then you can make really the movements which suit a special character.
So you develop a kind of relationship to the puppet itself,
yes,
as though it were an extension of yourself almost.
Yes, well, maybe you could say so. And I like to play with puppets who are just the other side. I think I only play with men, and some of the people prefer to play with women, but I only play with the men, and I like to do that. I don't know why, but it's just the case.
And when I notice when you're up there, you have a lot of hand movements and certain special devices on. Could you describe a few of those that make the puppet itself move, or what are the special characteristics that are?
Yes, well, in fact, there are only about 13 strings, so not all the movements are, not all the parts of the puppet are connected to strings. For example, the feet just move by themselves, so you have to make some movements, but have to take care of the natural movement of the puppet himself. And well, these are his arms and his legs are quite normal strings, but the head is attached to iron strings, so that you can make more abstract, very abrupt movements and turn to the side instead of only moving up and down. And well, it's quite easy to learn about the basic movements like walking or moving the head or moving arms, but the most difficult part is to move them all together and to really make music with it and to combine all these things. That's the most difficult part. And you learn all the time. You're never finished with learning to play them.
We continue a very old tradition, the tradition of the European classical marionette theatre. which was developed in the 18th century, the time of Mozart and Joseph Haydn. For example, Joseph Haydn composed special marionette operas. And the thought behind all this was that quite a lot of composers, writers, theater people thought, well, yes, in the best case, opera singers have a beautiful voice, but the acting is most of the times not on their niveau of singing. And well, there is a tragic fate that the more beautiful the voice, the more ridiculous the opera singer looks. They are quite fat sometimes, and they have then, in that position, they have to play a young handsome prince, which is ridiculous. So they thought, we put the opera singers in the pit together with the orchestra, and on the stage we put our personages as beautiful, as young as they should be in the libretto. So a new genre was born. It was a sort of aristocratic invention, an experiment.
For your own experience, you have a somewhat diverse background. Could you give us a little about how you yourself came to the marionette?
There are quite a lot of roads going to Rome. Originally, I was a clinical psychologist. I worked for 8 years as a psychologist in a hospital. But there I became more interested in the problems of the condition humaine in a more metaphoric way. So then the theater, the music theater, which also goes on human problems, was more interesting for me. So by being an assistant of Philippe Sanjust, Italian stage designer and regisseur, I was his assistant for almost 6 years. And then I founded my own little opera troupe for 4 years, the Lyrische Comedie here in Amsterdam, and then I went to Germany as an opera regisseur and designer. But there gradually I liked the bigness, the grandeur of the big opera, but it's not my cup of tea. I like chamber music, like theater. So then I started thinking of a marionette opera production of a very naive opera, because I like naive operas. So I started doing Bastien et Bastienne by Mozart, and I never thought of founding an Amsterdam marionette theater. No, it was just a sabbatical year. Well, that sabbatical year is now 20 years.
Speaking of props, now when you think of an opera and you decide it's appropriate for the marionettes, what's the next step? And could you take us through those?
The first thing is that you have to study the little story, the plot, the libretto, in its archaic values. And that's also a criterion out of which I choose my repertory. It should have a strong archaic message, so it can be understood by a small child, but also a very erudite opera connoisseur, because I like to play for a very broad audience, not for a selected group of people. And I think the puppet theater is the theater for all. So when I have made my choice, I'm studying for the archaic values. And when I understand that, I try, the first question then is, because it's with music, what color goes with this music? That's an emotional thing. When I've made a decision, this Offenbach play, it needs greens. So then I start to study greens in nature, in gardens. I learn everything about greens and other colors. And then, which is very important, and I have learned quite a lot on that by looking at films of Hitchcock, because I don't know a storyteller like him. So you have to analyze the story, and then the question is, how do I make my visual pointes to tell my audience what's it about. And I must then find visual solutions to tell my audience what's going on. The dialogue is not important, perhaps a little bit, but no, they should see what is happening and then they should feel it by the music.
De schildknecht van de graaf van La Mancha.
Hello, this is David Heine. Amsterdam is a city known for its canals and for its beautiful canal houses. Today we're in one of the few houses that can be visited by the public. It is operated under the auspices of the Amsterdam Historical Society, and we're here to talk with curator Herbert Friedkan. Herbert, could you tell me a little of the history of this house?
Well, the house was built in the late 17th century, and it was the last part of the concentric row of canals that was filled in those decades, and for ages it was the home of illustrious people, burgomasters, regents, rich merchants, and in the 19th century the last inhabitants donated it to the city of Amsterdam to make it a museum, the Willet Holthuizen Museum.
And the last residents that lived here had a large collection of art, and is that mostly preserved here?
Yeah, for the most part it's preserved. It was the last will of Mrs. Willet. She died in 1895. Was that the house and its contents, and also the art collection of her husband, her late husband, would remain here in the house, and the house to become a museum with both their names attached to it.
Herbert, could you tell me a little about the renovation of the last residents of this place, and what was their style?
Well, the Willets resided here from 1861 onwards, and they decided to have the house redone in the fashion of that particular decade. That was the international Louis XVI style, originated of course in France. And the Willets traveled extensively to France. They had even a house, a mansion in the near Paris, and so they redid the main rooms in the house in that fashionable Louis XVI style. You can see it in the ballroom, here in the corridor with the decorative panels hanging on the walls done by Paul Collin, French decorative painter, etc., etc.
Now the lifestyle, I'm often curious about the lifestyle of these very wealthy people that live here. How did they carry on day-to-day life here? I mean, it's so big, it would seem you'd almost be lost in it. How did the life go?
Well, I wished I knew, but for sure. But you can only guess, and you have sometimes you have diaries in which people tell what they did. Of course, very rich people, as the Willets were, had their own daily schedule. Mr. Willet didn't work; he didn't have to. Mrs. Willet had the money, and so. They traveled extensively through Europe. They went to Naples. They stayed away for months, And then on their way back, they stayed for a while in their house in their French countryside, and then they came back to Amsterdam again. So it's very difficult for us to get a proper view on the daily schedule of this house, but it must have been some sort of regime, of course, with people working in the kitchen and a valet, and there was a coach house at the back of the garden. So well, you can imagine how life carried on in these houses. Sometimes a party in or a bal masqué in the ballroom over there.